The second lecture that's going to go with the first assignment is called Organizing the Diversity of Life. So this is in section 1.2, Evolution, Core Concept of Biology, but we're not going to cover the entire section. You're only responsible for this little subsection. So two things that will be helpful to you, or one thing that will be helpful, is you'll want to be looking at table 1.2 as I talk about this. Now, life being organized and how we classify things are two different things. So this is going to be how we classify organisms. The other was how organisms were organized by their parts. You probably are very familiar with this already. Maybe you've learned this at one time. You may know the mnemonic king phylum called the class, order, family, genus, species. But if you've forgotten or haven't heard that, the largest group that we classify organisms are called domains. That means that we're going to put everything basically into three groups. There are three domains that you need to know. One of these is the domain bacteria. So you can see in table 1.2 that we have a column labeled domain, and then we have a label called kingdom. So once we know that something is living, we're going to put it into one of three boxes. Another group, so we can say this would be the box that we put all of our bacteria into. A second domain is called domain archaea. And the third group is domain eukarya. So right now, if you find a living organism, it will go into one of these three boxes. We'll talk a little bit about bacteria and archaea this semester, but by and large, that's what we talk about a lot in microbiology. We'll be focusing a lot on eukarya, and in particular, we'll be talking about two groups of eukarya. The next biggest group, so every time we go down, this is going to be the largest grouping, and everything will be subsets within that. The next biggest grouping are called kingdoms. So in this group eukarya, for instance, there are going to be four subsets within that. Those four subsets are going to be the animals, the plants, the fungi, and the protists. So once I find an organism, I'll put it into one of these three. And just so you know, bacteria have kingdoms as well, and archaea have kingdoms as well. We're just not going to go into any of them. You do need to know the four kingdoms of eukarya. So those four kingdoms are your animals, your plants, your fungi, and your protists. And if you look at table 1.2, you'll see the second column is kingdoms. And you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, all protists, plants, animals, and fungi are all in the domain eukarya. So we can continue on. We're going to get even smaller subgroups. I'm going to have to erase my groupings over here. But each time we get a new group, we're going to go a little bit smaller. The next smallest group is called a phylum. So if we were to have a domain, that would be the biggest group. Within that would be a kingdom. Within that will be a phylum. So this is a subgroup of our kingdoms. Even smaller is a class. So inside of my phylum, I have a class. And then we go to order, even smaller. Then family, then genus, and then species. Remember we mentioned species before. This is a group of organisms that all have have similar characteristics. So each of these, once again, will get smaller and smaller and smaller until finally that inner circle, that's going to represent a single species. Each genus may have one or several species. Each family may have one or several genera. You don't need to understand how those things go on. You just need to know these are the groupings from largest to smallest. If you were to take a class later on, maybe in taxonomy or phylogeny, you would go into how different things are named. This is actually where I did a lot of my graduate work in, and I've named about 6 or 7 different species of a little animal called a springtail. And so now I get to keep that as part of my legacy forever. So these are the domains through species, which are how we classify organisms. The other thing that I want you to know is some generalities about those domains and kingdoms. So I'm going to put them back up again. So we had domain bacteria. And we have domain archaea. And we have domain eukarya. Now, one thing that is similar about bacteria and archaea, they both have a similar cell structure. They are prokaryotic. So we talked about what was a prokaryotic cell last week. So if you find something that has a very simple cellular structure, you're probably looking at something in either domain bacteria or domain archaea. As this name implies, the domain eukarya are eukaryotic cells. Oops, forgot my Y. So if both of these are prokaryotes, how do we tell them apart? So table 1.2 also helps us out with this. In general, the domain archaea live in what are considered extreme environments. So if you've heard about these weird organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean next to volcanoes, very high pressure environments, very hot environments, these are often domain archaea. It's not to say that they can't live in other things that are not extreme, it's just that they're generally associated with more extreme environments. Or if you go to Yellowstone Park, some of those springs out there are highly acidic. Well, these have figured out how to live in those really acidic environments. The domain bacteria, these are what you think of as your common single-celled organisms. So these are what we think of when we think of the gross bacteria that we have in our mouths or all throughout our body. These are predominantly your domain bacteria. Now in the domain eukarya, we have those 4 kingdoms. So we're going to need to know how to tell those apart. So we have the kingdom Animalia. We have the kingdom Plantae. We have the kingdom Fungi. And we have the kingdom Protista. So all of these are multicellular. So all 3 of these groups are multicellular. Protists can be either multi or single-celled. So remember, to tell these single cells from these single cells, it comes back to the cellular structure. Single-celled and simple, bacteria or archaea. Single-celled and complex cells like eukaryotic cells, protistans. But all 3 of these other kingdoms are all multicellular. So how do we tell those apart? Well, that's going to come down to how do we get those energy and those nutrients. Animals will ingest their food. You're an animal. You ingest food. You place it into your oral cavity, where you then masticate it and allow it to travel through your digestive system. On the other side, the kingdom fungi, they absorb their nutrients. So they will actually excrete enzymes outside of their body, let stuff break down outside, and then they will suck up the broken down stuff. Whereas the kingdom plantae, we saw that one of their unique characteristics were those chloroplasts in which they carried out photosynthesis. Plants can make their own food. That's a very nice thing to be able to do. Animals and fungi have to rely on plants to make food. The plants will use that food for themselves, and then we also eat them. Another thing that fungi do is they will decompose stuff. So when you die, something needs to break you down. Fungi often will do that. Now the kingdom Protista, it's a really weird group. It will do all of these things. So there's nothing really unique about the kingdom Protista. It can act like an animal sometimes it acts like a plant, sometimes it acts like a fungi. So pretty much, if you're not an animal, a plant, or a fungi, we end up throwing you into this last bin because we don't really know where to put you right now. And that's where you stay until we learn more about how you fit into the bigger scheme. That is our classification of organisms.